The hot sun beat down on the bustling streets of downtown Atlanta. People hurried past, focused on their errands, unaware that one corner of the city was about to witness an incident that would spark headlines across the nation. Near a busy coffee shop, a middle-aged white police officer, Officer Gerald Langston, stood facing a tall, well-dressed black man. The man's sharp navy blue suit and polished shoes contrasted with the chaos of the street. His demeanor was calm, his expression firm but respectful. Yet, something about him seemed to irritate Officer Langston. Maybe it was the confident way he stood, or the fact that he wasn't intimidated by the officer's aggressive tone. "I said move back," Langston barked, stepping closer to the man, who remained unmoved. "I'm simply asking you to clarify," the man replied, his deep voice steady. Langston's patience snapped. He leaned forward, his face red with anger, and spat directly in the man's face. The crowd gasped. Time seemed to freeze as the spit landed on the man's cheek, sliding down the side of his face. The man didn't flinch. He reached for a handkerchief, wiped his face, and then looked directly into the officer's eyes. "Officer Langston," the man said quietly, "I am Deputy Director Charles Dawson, FBI." Langston's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The gathered crowd began murmuring, cell phones held high, recording every second of the shocking encounter. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Charles leaned in, his voice low but cutting. "Now, let me see how you plan to fix this." The day had started uneventfully for Charles Dawson. It was supposed to be a rare day off, free from the pressures of his demanding position. As the Deputy Director of the FBI, his schedule rarely allowed for downtime, but today he had decided to enjoy a walk and grab a cup of coffee at his favorite cafe. Charles wasn't in the habit of flaunting his position. In fact, he preferred blending into the crowd when he could. He had worked hard to reach the second highest rank in the FBI, and he carried himself with quiet confidence. As he waited in line at the cafe, he noticed a commotion outside. A young black teenager, perhaps 16 or 17, was being questioned by Officer Langston. The boy's hands trembled as he tried to explain himself, but Langston's voice grew louder with each passing second. "You fit the description," Langston barked. "Description of what?" the boy stammered. "I was just walking." "Don't talk back to me," Langston interrupted. Charles stepped out of the cafe, drawn by the tension. He couldn't ignore the situation. The officer's tone and body language were aggressive, and the boy looked terrified. "Excuse me, officer," Charles said, his voice calm but firm. "Is there an issue here?" Langston turned to face Charles, his expression immediately hardening. "Who the hell are you, and why are you interfering?" "I'm just a concerned citizen," Charles replied. "The boy doesn't appear to be doing anything wrong. Perhaps this could be resolved without escalating." Langston's eyes narrowed. "Stay out of this. I don't need some suit telling me how to do my job." Charles held his ground. "I'm not telling you how to do your job. I'm simply suggesting that perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." The exchange drew the attention of passers-by. Some stopped to watch, while others pulled out their phones to record. Charles noticed the crowd but kept his focus on the officer. Langston's anger grew. He stepped closer to Charles, invading his personal space. "I said move back." Charles remained still. "Officer, I'm asking you to reconsider." And that's when Langston spat. The crowd's collective gasp echoed down the street. Charles felt the hot spit land on his face. The humiliation stung more than the action itself. But Charles wasn't a man who lost his composure easily. He took out his handkerchief, wiped his face, and then revealed his identity. As Langston stood frozen, Charles turned to the crowd. "Keep those recordings," he said. "They'll be needed." Langston's hand twitched toward his radio, as if considering calling for backup, but his hesitation betrayed his fear. He knew he had crossed a line, and the weight of his actions was beginning to sink in. The boy, who had been watching in stunned silence, took a cautious step back. "Sir," he said softly, addressing Charles, "are you okay?" Charles nodded, his expression softening as he looked at the teenager. "I'm fine. But this isn't over." He turned back to Langston, who now looked as if he wanted to disappear. The crowd had grown larger, and the murmurs of outrage were growing louder. Charles glanced at the phones pointed in their direction, knowing this moment would soon spread far beyond the streets of Atlanta. Langston tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Charles didn't give him a chance to recover. "Officer Langston," he said, I suggest you think very carefully about your next move. Because trust me, every single one of your actions from here on will be under scrutiny. Langston's face twitched, a mixture of fear and defiance flickering in his eyes. The weight of what he had done, and to whom, was beginning to sink in. And then, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the tense air. Someone in the crowd must have called the police. Charles didn't turn toward the sound. His focus remained locked on Langston. The officer's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His chest heaved as he struggled to keep his composure. The sirens grew louder, and the crowd shifted, parting to make way for the arriving police vehicles. Charles finally stepped back, his expression calm but unyielding. "Let's see how you handle this," he said quietly. The tension in the air was palpable as the first squad car came to a screeching halt. Officers stepped out, their eyes darting between Langston, Charles, and the crowd. And then, Charles spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Call your commanding officer. Now." Langston hesitated, his hand hovering over his radio. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their outrage evident. Phones continued to record every moment. Charles didn't look away. "I said, call your commanding officer." Langston finally reached for his radio, his movements stiff and reluctant. The scene was far from over, and Charles knew that what happened next would determine more than just the outcome of this incident. It would set the tone for a much larger conversation. The sirens cut out as the squad car engines idled. Two officers stepped out, their badges glinting in the sunlight. They scanned the scene, their eyes settling on Officer Langston and Charles. The tension in the air was thick, the crowd watching intently, phones still recording. Langston's face was pale, his jaw clenched tight. He lifted his radio reluctantly and called for his commanding officer. His voice shook slightly, betraying the turmoil beneath his aggressive facade. "This is Officer Langston. I need Captain Hayes at my location immediately," he muttered, avoiding eye contact with Charles. Charles stood tall, his expression unreadable. He folded his arms across his chest, the picture of quiet authority. The crowd, emboldened by his calm defiance, murmured words of support. "Did you see that?" someone said. "He spit on him." "And he's FBI," another added, their voice dripping with disbelief. Charles didn't react to the comments. He kept his focus on Langston, whose anger had shifted into a mix of panic and defiance. The officer tried to maintain some semblance of control, but his shifting stance and darting eyes betrayed his unease. "Officer Langston," one of the newly arrived officers said cautiously, stepping closer, "What's going on here?" Langston didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Charles, then at the crowd, before muttering, "It's nothing. Just a misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. Charles finally spoke, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Spitting in someone's face is not a misunderstanding. It's an assault." The officer who had spoken frowned and turned toward Langston. "Is that true?" Langston didn't respond. His silence was damning. Before the officer could press further, another car pulled up. This one was sleek and unmarked, its dark windows hiding its occupants. The door opened, and a tall, imposing man stepped out. His captain's bars gleamed in the sunlight, and his expression was one of irritation mixed with concern. Captain Hayes strode toward the scene, his eyes sweeping over the crowd before landing on Langston. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his tone sharp. Langston stiffened, but before he could speak, Charles stepped forward. "I'll tell you what's going on," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This officer," he gestured toward Langston, "assaulted me in front of multiple witnesses. He spat in my face when I questioned his treatment of a young man." Captain Hayes's eyes widened slightly as he registered who he was speaking to. "And you are?" "Deputy Director Charles Dawson, FBI," Charles replied. His calm demeanor only amplified the weight of his words. "And I expect this to be handled with the seriousness it deserves." Hayes's expression tightened as the gravity of the situation sank in. He turned to Langston, his face darkening. "Is this true, Officer Langston?" Langston stammered, his confidence completely gone. He was interfering. I was handling a suspect and he—" "Suspect?" Charles interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "A boy walking down the street is a suspect? What crime was he committing, Officer Langston?" Langston floundered, unable to come up with an answer. The crowd, sensing his discomfort, began to murmur more loudly. "Typical," someone said. "We've seen this before," another added, their tone bitter. Captain Hayes raised a hand to silence the crowd before turning back to Langston. "Did you spit on him?" he asked bluntly. Langston's face flushed, and he looked away. "Yes or no, Officer Langston?" Hayes barked, his patience wearing thin. Langston's shoulders sagged. "Yes, sir," he admitted quietly. The crowd erupted in angry whispers and exclamations. Charles remained still, his gaze steady on Hayes. Hayes took a deep breath, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. "Officer Langston, hand over your badge and weapon. You're relieved of duty pending an investigation." Langston's head snapped up. "Captain, wait. Now, Langston." Hayes thundered. With shaky hands, Langston unfastened his badge and gun, placing them in Hayes's outstretched hand. The captain turned back to Charles, his expression a mix of apology and professionalism. "Mr. Dawson, I sincerely apologize for this incident. I assure you, this will be handled appropriately." Charles nodded but didn't soften. "I'll make sure it is. And I'll also be in touch with your Internal Affairs Department. This isn't just about me, it's about what could have happened to that boy." He gestured toward the teenager, who was now standing off to the side, wide-eyed and uncertain. Hayes followed Charles's gaze and seemed to notice the boy for the first time. "What's your name, son?" Hayes asked, his tone gentler. "Tyrell," the boy mumbled. "Tyrell," Charles said, walking over to him, "are you okay?" Tyrell nodded hesitantly. "Yes, sir. Thanks to you." Charles placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You didn't do anything wrong. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." The crowd, now firmly on Charles's side, cheered softly at his words. The tension in the air began to ease, but the damage had been done. Langston stood to the side, his face a mask of humiliation as Hayes addressed him one last time. "Go home, Langston," Hayes said coldly. "And pray you still have a career after this." Langston didn't reply. He turned and walked away, the crowd parting to let him pass. The cameras followed his every move, ensuring his shame would be shared far and wide. Charles watched him go, his expression unreadable. But inside, he knew this was far from over. This was just the beginning. As Hayes turned back to Charles, a sudden commotion erupted in the crowd. Someone shouted, and heads turned toward the street. Charles's instincts kicked in immediately, his eyes scanning for the source of the disturbance. And then he saw it, a black SUV speeding toward them, its windows tinted, and its intentions unclear. The crowd scattered, screams filling the air as the vehicle barreled forward. Charles stepped in front of Tyrell, his heart pounding. Hayes shouted for everyone to get down, but the SUV didn't slow. It was coming straight for them. The SUV hurtled forward, tires screeching as the crowd scrambled for safety. Charles's mind raced, his instincts honed from years in law enforcement. He shoved Tyrell behind him and stepped into a defensive stance, his sharp eyes locked on the vehicle. Captain Hayes barked orders into his radio, calling for backup, but there was no time to wait. The SUV swerved at the last second, narrowly missing Charles and Tyrell. It skidded to a halt, blocking the street. For a moment, everything was silent except for the ticking of the engine. Then the driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out, a burly figure in dark clothing with a hardened expression. He glanced at the gathered crowd, then fixed his eyes on Charles. "Dawson," the man called, his voice booming. "You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Charles didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his body shielding Tyrell. "Who are you and what do you want?" he demanded, his tone calm but firm. The man smirked. "Just delivering a message. Back off or next time, we won't miss." As if on cue, the back doors of the SUV swung open, and two more men stepped out, both armed. The crowd gasped, many ducking behind cars and storefronts. Phones were still recording, but the danger was palpable. Charles could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins. Hayes stepped forward, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "You're threatening a federal officer," he said, his voice steady. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're in?" The leader chuckled. "Federal officer or not, he's made some powerful enemies." Charles's mind raced. This wasn't random. Someone had sent these men, and they knew who he was. But who? And why now? "Tyrell," Charles said quietly, keeping his eyes on the men. "Stay low and stay behind me. Don't move unless I tell you." Tyrell nodded, his face pale but determined. The leader gestured toward Charles with his gun. "This is your last warning. Walk away from whatever you're digging into, or—" He didn't finish his sentence. A flash of blue lights filled the street as more squad cars arrived, their sirens wailing. The armed men hesitated, glancing at each other. It was clear they hadn't expected reinforcements so soon. "Drop your weapons," Hayes commanded, his gun now drawn and aimed. "Hands where I can see them." The men hesitated, their confidence wavering. Then, with a sneer, the leader turned and jumped back into the SUV. "Let's go," he barked to his companions. The other two men scrambled into the vehicle, and the driver hit the gas. The SUV roared to life, tires squealing as it sped away. Hayes shouted into his radio, calling for units to pursue, but Charles knew they wouldn't catch them. These men were professionals. As the SUV disappeared into the distance, the tension in the street slowly began to dissipate. The crowd, still shaken, started murmuring again, their phones still pointed at Charles and Hayes. "You okay?" Hayes asked, holstering his weapon and turning to Charles. "I'm fine," Charles said, though his jaw was tight. "But this isn't over. They knew who I was, and they came here for a reason." Hayes nodded grimly. "We'll track them down. You have my word." Charles turned to Tyrell, who was still standing close by. "You all right, kid?" Tyrell nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah. Thanks to you." Charles placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now. But you need to be careful. Stay close to home for a while." Tyrell's eyes widened. "You think they'll come after me?" Charles hesitated. He didn't want to scare the boy, but he couldn't lie. "I don't think you were their target, but it's better to be cautious." Hayes stepped in. "We'll get officers to keep an eye on him," he said. "No one's going to mess with you, Tyrell." The boy nodded, his fear easing slightly. Charles glanced at the dispersing crowd. The day had taken a dark turn, and the incident was far from resolved. Later that evening, Charles sat in his office, reviewing security footage from the scene. His desk was cluttered with reports and files, but his focus was on the SUV and the men who had emerged from it. Something about their confidence, their precision, struck a chord. This wasn't just a random act of intimidation. This was calculated. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Agent Rachel Cooper, one of his most trusted colleagues, entered. Her expression was serious. "Sir, we've run the plates on the SUV. It was stolen earlier today. No prints, no leads so far." Charles sighed. "Not surprising. These men are professionals. Whoever sent them has resources." Rachel hesitated. "There's something else. I did some digging, and it looks like Officer Langston has connections to a private security firm with a questionable reputation." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Questionable how?" "Shady contracts, accusations of excessive force, even ties to organized crime," Rachel said. "Nothing proven, but enough to raise red flags." Charles leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Langston had seemed like a hot-headed cop with a chip on his shoulder, but if he was connected to something bigger, it could explain a lot. "Dig deeper," he instructed. "I want to know everything about this firm and its ties to Langston." Rachel nodded. "Already on it." As she left the room, Charles stared at the footage on his screen. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was far from clear. He knew one thing for certain: whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop. And neither was he. Just as he leaned back in his chair, his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with an unknown number. Charles hesitated for a moment before answering. "Dawson," he said. A deep, distorted voice replied. "You should have walked away, Charles. Now you've made yourself a target." The line went dead. Charles stared at the phone, his jaw tightening. The game had just escalated, and the stakes were higher than ever. Charles set the phone down, his expression hardening as the distorted voice replayed in his mind. The message was clear: whoever was behind this wanted him out of the way. But Charles wasn't the type to back down, not when lives were at stake, and certainly not when someone thought intimidation would make him cower. He quickly activated a secure line and called Agent Rachel Cooper. "Rachel, we've got a problem," he said as soon as she picked up. "Someone just called me, made it clear I'm now a target." "Did you trace the call?" Rachel asked, her voice immediately alert. "I didn't have time. But something tells me it won't lead anywhere. These people are careful. Rachel was quiet for a moment. I'll beef up security on your residence and office. Do you think this is connected to the Langston incident? It's all connected, Charles said firmly. The SUV attack, Langston, the private security firm, it's a web, and we're barely scratching the surface. I'll pull an all-nighter if I have to, Rachel said. We'll find whoever is behind this. Charles hung up, appreciating Rachel's dedication but knowing the stakes were higher than ever. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he tried to piece everything together. Langston's overreaction on the street didn't feel random anymore. It was part of something bigger. And now, it had his full attention. The next morning, Charles arrived at the FBI field office in Atlanta. He was greeted by Rachel, who looked like she hadn't slept. A stack of files sat on her desk, and she handed him the top one as he approached. "We've got something," Rachel said, gesturing for him to follow her into a secure conference room. Once inside, Rachel pulled up a digital file on the screen. The private security firm Langston's connected to is called Apex Solutions. On paper, they provide security for high-profile clients and corporations. But their off-the-books activities include intimidation, illegal surveillance, and even suspected hits. Charles's eyes narrowed. And Langston. His connection to them is through a man named Victor Harland. Harland runs Apex and has a reputation for keeping his hands clean, but his name pops up in connection with several shady deals. Do we have anything concrete on him? Not yet. But here's the kicker. Apex recently acquired a government contract for an infrastructure project. Guess who approved it? Rachel paused for effect. Langston's precinct commander, Captain Hayes. Charles frowned. Hayes? He seemed straightforward when I spoke to him. Rachel nodded. Maybe he is. But this contract was pushed through fast, and there's no oversight. If Hayes was pressured into approving it, Apex might have more leverage in the police department than we realized. The implications were chilling. If Apex had infiltrated law enforcement, it explained a lot about Langston's confidence on the street. And it meant this was no ordinary case of police misconduct. It was corruption on a larger scale. Later that afternoon, Charles visited Tyrell and his family at their modest home in a quiet Atlanta neighborhood. Tyrell's mother, a hard-working nurse, had been reluctant to let him out of her sight since the incident. "Thank you for what you did for my boy," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't even want to think about what could have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Charles smiled warmly. Tyrell didn't do anything wrong. No one should go through what he went through. Tyrell, sitting quietly at the kitchen table, looked up. "Are those guys going to come after me again?" Charles crouched down to meet his eye level. "Listen to me, Tyrell. We're going to make sure you're safe. But I need you to be brave. If anyone tries to bother you or your family, call me immediately. Understand?" Tyrell nodded, his fear giving way to determination. As Charles left, he couldn't shake the feeling that Tyrell's ordeal was part of something much bigger. And if Apex was behind it, the boy's safety was far from guaranteed. That evening, Charles reviewed the footage from the SUV attack again, this time with the FBI's tech team. They enhanced the images, identifying one of the armed men who had confronted him, a known Apex operative with a criminal record for extortion and assault. His name was Kenneth Reeves. Reeves has been off the radar for months, one of the analysts explained. If he's working for Apex now, it means they're ramping up their operations. Charles nodded, his jaw tight. "Find out everything you can about him. I want to know where he sleeps, who he talks to, and what his next move might be." A few days later, Charles got a tip. Reeves had been spotted at a downtown warehouse owned by Apex. Surveillance teams had confirmed unusual activity there, unmarked vans, armed guards, and late-night deliveries. It was enough to warrant a closer look. Charles led a team of FBI agents on a covert operation to the warehouse. The plan was simple: gather evidence without tipping Apex off. But as they approached the building under the cover of darkness, something felt off. "Stay sharp," Charles whispered to his team. "This doesn't feel right." The agents moved carefully, their weapons drawn, as they entered the warehouse. The inside was filled with crates and equipment, but it was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Then, the lights went out. "Ambush!" someone shouted. The room erupted into chaos as armed men emerged from the shadows, guns blazing. Charles ducked behind a stack of crates, returning fire as his team scattered for cover. The Apex operatives were well trained, their movements coordinated. Charles's heart pounded as he took out one of the attackers. He could hear his team calling for backup over the radio, but he knew reinforcements would take time. For now, it was a fight for survival. Then, amidst the gunfire, Charles spotted him, Kenneth Reeves, slipping out a side door. Reeves is making a run for it. Charles shouted, breaking cover to pursue him. He sprinted through the warehouse, weaving between crates and dodging bullets. Reeves had a head start, but Charles was faster. He burst through the side door just in time to see Reeves climbing into a waiting van. Charles raised his weapon. "Stop, FBI." Reeves turned, a smirk on his face, and threw something toward Charles. A flashbang. The blinding light and deafening noise sent Charles reeling, his vision swimming as he stumbled backward. By the time he recovered, the van was gone, its taillights disappearing into the night. Charles stood there, his chest heaving, as the sound of sirens signaled the arrival of backup. He clenched his fists, frustration boiling inside him. Reeves had slipped through his fingers, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Charles leaned against the wall of the now-cleared warehouse, his ears still ringing from the flashbang. The FBI tactical team was sweeping the area, securing evidence and apprehending a few Apex operatives who hadn't escaped. But Charles's mind was fixed on Kenneth Reeves and the taillights vanishing into the night. Rachel Cooper arrived, stepping carefully over scattered debris. "You all right?" she asked, eyeing the slight limp in his step. "I'm fine," Charles replied curtly. "Reeves got away." Rachel sighed, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "We've got 3 of their men in custody. Maybe they'll give us something." Charles shook his head. "They won't talk. These types are loyal, either out of fear or greed. We'll need a different approach." Rachel handed him a tablet displaying images from the warehouse's surveillance cameras. "We've got partial footage of the exchange before the ambush. Look at this." Charles scanned the video. It showed crates being unloaded from unmarked vans and Apex operatives checking what appeared to be weapons. But what caught his attention was a brief glimpse of a man in a tailored suit directing the operation, a face Charles hadn't seen before. "Who's that?" he asked, tapping the screen. "We're running facial recognition now," Rachel said. "But if he's overseeing an arms deal, he's high up in Apex's chain of command." Charles studied the image closely. The man exuded authority, his posture commanding even in a still frame. Whoever he was, Charles knew he was a key player, and finding him might be the break they needed. Back at the field office, the atmosphere was tense but focused. The captured operatives were being interrogated, but as Charles predicted, they offered nothing but silence. Meanwhile, the tech team worked tirelessly to track the van that had spirited Reeves away. Hours later, Rachel burst into Charles's office with a triumphant look. "We've got a hit on the man from the footage. His name is Dominic Kane. He's the COO of Apex Solutions." Charles's eyebrows rose. "The COO? That's close to the top." Rachel nodded. "He's been with Apex for over a decade. No criminal record, but his name surfaces in connection with several questionable deals. Arms smuggling, private military contracts, even ties to political lobbying." Charles leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. If Kane's involved, this isn't just about intimidation. They're running something big, and they're using Langston and others like him to grease the wheels. Rachel crossed her arms. "We need to bring Kane in for questioning." "We will," Charles said. "But we need more than just the footage. We need evidence that ties him directly to these crimes." Rachel hesitated. "There's one more thing. We traced the van Reeves escaped in. It led us to a property on the outskirts of Atlanta. It's registered to a shell corporation linked to Apex." Charles straightened in his chair. "We move on it. Tonight." As night fell, Charles led a team to the property, a sprawling compound surrounded by high fences and security cameras. It was clear Apex had gone to great lengths to protect whatever was inside. The team moved in quietly, disabling the cameras and cutting through the fence. Charles's pulse quickened as they approached the main building. The compound was eerily quiet, but he knew better than to assume it was abandoned. Inside, the team found more crates, similar to the ones at the warehouse. They pried one open to reveal a stash of high-powered rifles. Another crate contained surveillance equipment. "This isn't just a weapons stash," Charles muttered. They're running a full-scale operation. Rachel called from another room. Charles, you need to see this. He followed her to a small office where a laptop sat on a desk. The screen displayed a series of encrypted files, but one folder caught Charles's eye, Langston_project_files. Charles's stomach turned as he opened the folder. Inside were reports, surveillance photos, and documents detailing Apex's infiltration of local police departments. Langston's name appeared frequently, along with notes about other officers who had been compromised or coerced. This is it, Rachel said, her voice grim. This ties Apex to Langston and exposes their whole scheme. Charles nodded. We take it all. Every file, every document. This is the leverage we need. As the team worked to secure the evidence, a sudden noise outside caught Charles's attention. The sound of engines roaring to life. Ambush, someone shouted. Charles drew his weapon and sprinted to the front of the building. A convoy of black SUVs was barreling toward the compound, headlights cutting through the darkness. The Apex reinforcements had arrived. The firefight erupted quickly, bullets ricocheting off walls as Charles and his team took cover. The Apex operatives were relentless, their assault coordinated and aggressive. Charles returned fire, taking out one of the attackers, but they just kept coming. Rachel ducked behind a crate beside him. We're outnumbered. Hold the line. Charles barked. Backup's on the way. As the battle raged, Charles spotted a familiar figure among the attackers, Kenneth Reeves. He was shouting orders, directing the assault with a confidence that only fueled Charles's determination. I'm going after Reeves. Charles called to Rachel. Cover me. He moved swiftly, weaving through the chaos as he closed in on Reeves. The man spotted him and bolted toward one of the SUVs. Charles pursued, his heart pounding as he closed the distance. Reeves reached the vehicle and pulled the door open, but Charles tackled him before he could climb inside. The two men hit the ground hard, grappling as the fight around them continued. You don't get to run this time, Charles growled, pinning Reeves to the ground. Reeves smirked despite the situation. You think this ends with me? You're in over your head, Dawson. Charles ignored him, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. We'll see about that. Before he could secure the cuffs, an Apex operative lunged at him from behind, knocking him off Reeves. Charles fought back, landing a solid punch that sent the attacker sprawling, but the distraction gave Reeves the chance to slip away. As Reeves disappeared into the chaos, the sound of sirens filled the air. Backup had arrived, and the Apex operatives, realizing they were outmatched, began retreating. Charles stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving as the scene finally settled. They had secured the compound and the evidence, but Reeves had escaped again. Rachel approached, her face a mix of relief and frustration. We've got the files, and most of their men are in custody. But Reeves. He won't get far, Charles said, his jaw set. We have what we need to dismantle Apex. Now we finish this. The next morning, the FBI office in Atlanta buzzed with activity. The files recovered from the Apex compound had been transported to the secure lab, where analysts worked around the clock to decrypt and organize the data. Charles stood at the center of it all, directing efforts while silently seething over Reeves's escape. Rachel approached with a steaming cup of coffee, her face drawn from lack of sleep. We've cracked some of the encryption, she said, handing Charles a tablet. It's worse than we thought. Charles scanned the screen, his brow furrowing. The files detailed Apex's operations, arms deals, police corruption, and covert surveillance on politicians and community leaders. But one section stood out, a project labeled Silent Veil. What's Silent Veil? Charles asked, his voice low. Rachel shook her head. We're still piecing it together, but it looks like a large-scale plan involving multiple cities. They've been embedding operatives in law enforcement and municipal governments to expand their control. Charles's grip on the tablet tightened. This isn't just about Atlanta. Apex is trying to build a nationwide network. And they're using people like Langston to do it, Rachel added. Silent Veil explains why Langston reacted so violently in the street. He wasn't just protecting his ego, he was protecting Apex's operation. Charles nodded. And now that we've exposed them, they'll be desperate. Reeves's attack last night proves they're willing to go to any lengths to protect their secrets. Rachel hesitated. There's something else. We found a file marked Dawson. They've been monitoring you. Charles felt a chill run down his spine as Rachel handed him a printout. The file contained surveillance photos of him at his home, his office, and even his rare moments of leisure. There were notes about his schedule, his routines, and his family. "They've been watching me for months," Charles said quietly. "And they know where you live," Rachel added, her tone grave. "We've already sent a team to secure your residence." Charles's mind raced. He wasn't afraid for himself. He had dealt with threats before. But this time, it felt different. Apex wasn't just targeting him as an FBI agent. They were trying to dismantle everything he stood for. That afternoon, a breakthrough came. One of the men captured during the warehouse raid had decided to talk. Under the pressure of mounting charges, he revealed a key detail. Kenneth Reeves was planning to meet with Dominic Kane, the Apex COO, in 2 days. The location was a secluded private airfield outside the city. "They're moving something big," the informant said. "Weapons, money, who knows? But Kane's going to be there, and so is Reeves." Charles leaned forward, his expression steely. "How do you know this?" The man hesitated, glancing at the agents in the room. "I've been running for them long enough to know the patterns. Kane only shows up when it's something major. They'll have heavy security." Charles stood, his jaw set. "Then we'll bring something heavier." Over the next 48 hours, Charles and his team prepared for the operation. The airfield was remote, with limited access points and dense woods surrounding the perimeter. It would be a high-risk mission, but the potential payoff was too great to ignore. If they could capture Kane and Reeves, they could cripple Apex. The night of the operation arrived. Charles stood with his team on the outskirts of the airfield, the cool night air heavy with anticipation. Through his binoculars, he could see the hangar, where several black SUVs and a private jet waited. Armed guards patrolled the area, their movements precise and disciplined. Rachel approached, her voice low. "Drones are in position. We've confirmed Kane and Reeves are both inside the hangar." "Then this is our chance," Charles said, lowering the binoculars. "Everyone knows the plan. Let's execute." The team moved in silence, splitting into small groups to cover the perimeter. Charles and Rachel led the main unit, creeping through the shadows toward the hangar. Every step felt like a lifetime, the tension coiling tighter with each moment. As they reached the hangar, Charles held up a fist, signaling the team to stop. He could hear voices inside, Kane and Reeves arguing about something. "This is a mess." Kane snapped. "The FBI's breathing down our necks, and now you've dragged them to our doorstep." Reeves's voice was cold. "We've handled worse. Dawson's just another cop with a badge. He won't be a problem for long." Charles's grip on his weapon tightened. He motioned for the team to take positions, his heart pounding as they prepared to breach the hangar. The doors burst open with a deafening crash, the FBI team flooding the hangar with weapons drawn. "FBI! Hands in the air!" Charles shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The Apex guards reacted immediately, drawing their weapons and opening fire. The hangar erupted into chaos, bullets ricocheting off metal beams as the firefight began. Charles ducked behind a crate, returning fire as his team spread out to engage the enemy. Through the haze of gunfire, Charles spotted Kane near the back of the hangar, frantically issuing orders to his men. Reeves was beside him, his face twisted in anger as he fired at the advancing agents. Charles locked eyes with Rachel. "I'm going after Kane. Cover me." Rachel nodded, providing suppressing fire as Charles moved through the fray. He weaved between crates and machinery, his focus locked on Kane. The COO was making a break for the jet, flanked by 2 guards. "Kane, stop!" Charles shouted, raising his weapon. Kane turned, his face pale but defiant. "You don't know what you're getting into, Dawson," he sneered. "This is bigger than you." "I don't care how big it is," Charles said, his voice cold. "It ends here." Before Kane could respond, one of his guards lunged at Charles, forcing him into hand-to-hand combat. The man was strong, but Charles was faster. He blocked a punch and delivered a swift elbow to the man's jaw, sending him sprawling. By the time Charles turned back, Kane was boarding the jet. The engines roared to life, and the jet began to taxi down the runway. Charles sprinted after it, his heart pounding as he raised his weapon. "Stop!" he shouted again, firing at the tires. One of the bullets hit, and the jet swerved, coming to a screeching halt. The door opened, and Kane stumbled out, his hands raised in surrender. Charles advanced, his weapon trained on Kane. "It's over," he said, his voice steady. But before he could secure Kane, a shot rang out. Charles spun around to see Reeves aiming a rifle from the shadows. The bullet missed, but the distraction allowed Kane to dive behind cover. Charles fired back, hitting Reeves in the shoulder. The man cried out, dropping his weapon as he collapsed. Charles turned back to Kane, but the COO was gone, disappearing into the darkness beyond the hangar. The sound of approaching sirens signaled the arrival of reinforcements. Charles stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving as he surveyed the scene. They had captured Reeves and dismantled a key Apex operation, but Kane had slipped away. As Rachel approached, her expression a mix of relief and frustration, Charles knew one thing: the fight against Apex was far from over. The FBI field office was buzzing with activity the morning after the raid. Charles sat in an interrogation room, staring through the one-way glass at Kenneth Reeves. The Apex operative sat slumped in a chair, his arm in a sling from the gunshot wound, his expression defiant despite his predicament. Rachel entered the room, a folder in hand. "Reeves hasn't said a word since we brought him in," she said, taking a seat across from Charles. "He's playing tough, but we've got enough on him to bury him." Charles nodded, his focus unwavering. "He's not the endgame. We need Kane, and Reeves is the only one who can lead us to him." Rachel hesitated. "You think he'll flip? He doesn't strike me as the cooperative type." Charles stood, his jaw set. "He will. Everyone has a breaking point." Charles entered the interrogation room and closed the door behind him. Reeves looked up, a smug grin spreading across his face. "If you're here to lecture me, save your breath." Charles ignored the comment, pulling up a chair and sitting across from him. He placed a photo of Dominic Kane on the table between them. "Where is he?" Reeves chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You really think I'm going to tell you anything? I've been in tighter spots than this, Dawson." Charles's expression didn't change. He placed another photo on the table, this one of the weapons and surveillance equipment recovered from the warehouse. "We've already dismantled half your operation. It's only a matter of time before we get the rest. You have a choice: cooperate or go down with it." Reeves smirked. "I'll take my chances." Charles leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think Kane cares about you? He left you to take the fall while he ran. Do you really think he'll bail you out?" Reeves's smirk faltered, just for a moment. Charles caught it and pressed on. "You're expendable to him. But if you cooperate, I can help you. You might still have a life after this." Reeves stared at the photos, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Charles thought he might break, but then the smug grin returned. "Nice try. But I don't talk to cops." Charles stood, his patience wearing thin. "Enjoy prison, Reeves. It's where you'll spend the rest of your life." As Charles left the room, Rachel met him in the hallway. "No luck." "Not yet," Charles admitted. "But he's wavering. Keep the pressure on him. He'll crack." Later that day, Charles received a call from one of the analysts. "Sir, we've decrypted another batch of files from the warehouse. You're going to want to see this." Charles hurried to the secure lab, where the analyst pulled up a document on the screen. It was a detailed map of a city, Miami, with markings indicating key infrastructure points, bridges, power plants, and police stations. "What are we looking at?" Charles asked. "It's part of Silent Vale," the analyst explained. "Apex has been mapping critical infrastructure in major cities. If they're planning what we think they are, it's not just corruption, it's sabotage." Charles felt a chill run down his spine. "Sabotage? To what end?" "Destabilization," the analyst said grimly. "They could shut down cities, cripple the economy, and create chaos. And they've been quietly embedding operatives to make it happen." Charles's mind raced. Apex wasn't just a rogue corporation, they were a domestic threat on a massive scale. And Kane was orchestrating it all. That evening, Charles sat in his office, poring over the files. The stakes had never been higher, and every second Kane remained free brought them closer to disaster. His phone buzzed, breaking his focus. It was Rachel. "We've got a lead," she said. "Reeves isn't talking, but one of his men flipped. Kane has a safe house just outside Miami. He's been using it as a command center for Silent Vale." Charles's heart quickened. "Do we have a location?" "Sending it to you now," Rachel said. "But there's a catch. The safe house is heavily fortified. If we go in, we're walking into a war zone." Charles nodded, already steeling himself for what lay ahead. Then we bring the fight to them. The next night Charles and his team arrived outside the safe house, a sprawling estate surrounded by high walls and armed guards. It was clear Apex wasn't taking any chances. The FBI's tactical team had assembled in full force, prepared for an intense confrontation. Charles addressed the team, his voice steady but firm. "This is it. Kane is inside, and we're bringing him in. Stay sharp, cover each other, and don't let your guard down." The team moved in, breaching the gates and storming the compound. The guards reacted immediately, opening fire as the FBI advanced. The night erupted into chaos, bullets flying as the tactical team pressed forward. Charles led the charge, his weapon trained on the guards as he moved through the compound. He spotted Kane near the main building, barking orders as he tried to organize a defense. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Charles saw fear in the man's expression. "Kane!" Charles shouted. "You're done. Surrender now." Kane sneered, drawing a weapon and firing. Charles ducked behind cover, returning fire as he advanced. The firefight was brutal, but the FBI team had the advantage of training and coordination. One by one, the guards were subdued. As Charles reached the main building, he kicked the door open and entered. Kane was inside, frantically packing files and equipment into a bag. He turned as Charles entered, raising his weapon. "Don't do it," Charles warned, his voice low and steady. "It's over." Kane hesitated, his hand shaking. But instead of lowering the weapon, he smirked. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, Dawson." Before Charles could respond, Kane tossed a smoke grenade, filling the room with thick, choking fog. Charles coughed, his vision obscured as he heard footsteps retreating. He gave chase, following the sound through the smoke. As the air cleared, he found himself outside, where Kane was climbing into a waiting helicopter. The rotors roared to life as Charles raised his weapon, aiming for the engine. He fired, hitting the helicopter's tail rotor. The aircraft spun out of control, crashing into the nearby woods. Charles sprinted toward the wreckage, his heart pounding. Flames licked at the twisted metal as he approached, his weapon at the ready. He pulled open the door, coughing as smoke billowed out. Kane was inside, bloodied but alive. He looked up at Charles, his defiance replaced by fear. "It's over," Charles said, pulling him from the wreckage. "You're coming with me." As he dragged Kane back toward the compound, the sound of sirens signaled the arrival of backup. For the first time in days, Charles allowed himself a small smile. They had done it. Kane was in custody, and Apex's operation was crumbling. But Charles knew the battle wasn't over, not yet. There were still pieces to put together, and justice to deliver. The morning after Dominic Kane's capture, the FBI field office was a hive of activity. Charles watched through the observation window as Kane sat in the interrogation room, his suit torn and blood-stained, his face pale but composed. Despite the chaos of his arrest, Kane exuded a quiet confidence that unsettled Charles. Rachel approached, her arms filled with files. "We've been combing through the data from the safe house. Silent Vale is bigger than we thought. Multiple cities, multiple targets. Kane's the architect of the entire operation." "And yet he doesn't seem worried," Charles replied, narrowing his eyes at the man through the glass. Rachel set the files down and sighed. "That's what bothers me. He knows something we don't." Charles nodded. "Then it's time to find out what that is." Charles entered the interrogation room, carrying a slim file. He placed it on the table and sat across from Kane, who didn't acknowledge him at first. Instead, Kane adjusted his cuffs and stared at the two-way mirror. "You've been busy," Charles began, opening the file. "Illegal arms deals, corruption, sabotage. Silent Vale is an impressive operation. But it's over now." Kane finally looked at him, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Over? Agent Dawson, you're just scratching the surface." Charles leaned forward, his tone sharp. "You've lost. Your network is exposed, your operatives are in custody, and you're facing a life sentence. Tell me what I need to know, and maybe we'll consider a deal." Kane chuckled, the sound low and chilling. "A deal? You're underestimating how deep this goes. You've dismantled one branch of Apex, but there are others, stronger, smarter, and far more dangerous. You'll never stop it all." Charles didn't flinch. "Maybe. But you're going to help us try." Kane's smirk faded slightly, his confidence cracking for the first time. "I'm not giving you anything. Charles opened the file, revealing photographs from the raid, crates of weapons, surveillance equipment, and detailed maps of critical infrastructure. This evidence is enough to bury you. But if you cooperate, I might be able to keep you off death row. Kane's jaw tightened, his composure slipping further. You don't know what you're dealing with, Dawson. Apex is more than just a company, it's an ideology. Cut off one head, and another grows in its place. Charles stood, his voice cold. Then I'll cut them all. He left the room, his mind racing. Kane's words weren't empty threats. Apex had deeper roots than even Charles had suspected, and the fight was far from over. As the day wore on, the FBI continued unraveling Apex's web. Rachel briefed Charles on their findings: encrypted communications linking Apex to high-ranking officials, financial records pointing to offshore accounts, and plans for Silent Vale's next targets. They were gearing up for a massive strike, Rachel said, pointing to a map. New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. If we hadn't stopped them here, they could have crippled the country. Charles studied the map, his jaw tightening. We've got to move fast. Apex's remaining operatives won't sit idle. They'll regroup and escalate. Rachel nodded. We've already issued warrants for known associates. But there's something else. Kane's financial records show payments to someone high up in the Department of Defense. Charles's eyes narrowed. You're saying Apex has a mole in the government? It's possible, Rachel said. And if that's true, they've got access to classified information. Charles exhaled sharply. We need to find out who it is. Fast. That evening, Charles returned to the interrogation room. Kane was still seated, his calm demeanor restored. Charles placed a new file on the table, this one marked Top Secret. We found your payments to a high-ranking official in the Department of Defense, Charles said, his tone cold. You're working with someone on the inside. Kane's expression didn't change. I have no idea what you're talking about. Charles leaned forward, his voice low. You think you're untouchable, but you're not. You're facing charges of treason, terrorism, and conspiracy. If you don't cooperate, you'll spend the rest of your life in a box, or worse. For the first time, Kane hesitated. His eyes flickered to the file, then back to Charles. You're in over your head, Dawson. Apex isn't just a rogue operation, it's the future. And you can't stop it. Charles slammed the file shut, his patience wearing thin. Watch me. The breakthrough came the next morning. One of the analysts had decrypted a key piece of Apex's communications, a message from Kane to an unnamed contact in the Department of Defense. The message detailed plans to access classified data on national security protocols. This is it, Rachel said, showing Charles the transcript. Kane's mole was feeding him classified information. If we can identify them, we can cut off Apex's access. Charles nodded. Send the message to the cybersecurity team. Trace the contact and get me a name. Hours later, the team delivered results. The mole was identified as Colonel Richard Hayes, a high-ranking officer with access to sensitive defense operations. His communications with Kane had been carefully encrypted, but the FBI had uncovered enough to implicate him. Charles wasted no time. A warrant was issued, and a team was dispatched to arrest Hayes at his Washington, D.C. residence. Charles joined the operation, determined to see it through. When they arrived at Hayes's home, the scene was tense. The colonel answered the door, his face calm but wary. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice measured. Charles stepped forward, holding up the warrant. "Colonel Richard Hayes, you're under arrest for conspiracy and treason." Hayes's eyes narrowed, but he didn't resist as agents cuffed him. "You're making a mistake," he said evenly. "I've done nothing wrong." Charles ignored him, leading him to the waiting vehicle. As they drove back to the field office, Hayes maintained his composure, but Charles could sense the cracks forming. Back at the office, Charles and Rachel prepared for the interrogation. Hayes was a critical piece of the puzzle, and his cooperation could bring down the rest of Apex. "He's going to fight us every step of the way," Rachel said. Charles nodded. "Then we fight harder. This ends here." As Charles entered the interrogation room to face Hayes, he knew the battle against Apex was nearing its climax. But with every step forward, the stakes grew higher, and the danger more imminent. This was no longer just about dismantling a corrupt organization. It was about safeguarding the nation from a threat that refused to die. Colonel Richard Hayes sat at the interrogation table, his demeanor composed, but his eyes betrayed a hint of unease. Charles entered the room, carrying a thick dossier filled with damning evidence. He placed it on the table with deliberate force and took a seat across from Hayes. "You're in a precarious position, Colonel," Charles began, his tone sharp. "We've uncovered your communications with Dominic Kane, your financial transactions, and your involvement in Apex's Silent Veil operation. If you've got anything to say that might help your case, now's the time." Hayes leaned back in his chair, his face impassive. "You've made a mistake, Agent Dawson. Those are baseless accusations." Charles opened the dossier, revealing the intercepted emails and wire transfers. "These are anything but baseless. Payments from offshore accounts tied to Apex, encrypted messages planning coordinated attacks on critical infrastructure. This is treason, Colonel. And it carries the death penalty." For the first time, Hayes flinched, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand what's at stake." "Then explain it to me," Charles pressed. "You've got one chance to cooperate. Otherwise, you go down with Kane and the rest of Apex." Hayes hesitated, his fingers twitching against the table. Finally, he exhaled sharply and leaned forward. "You think you've stopped Apex, but you're wrong. Silent Veil was just one piece of the puzzle. The real plan is bigger, much bigger." Charles's pulse quickened. "What plan?" Hayes glanced at the one-way mirror, then back at Charles. "It's called Echelon. Kane and Apex have been working on it for years. It's not just about destabilizing cities, it's about rewriting the balance of power. Financial systems, energy grids, government networks, they're all targets." Charles's stomach sank. "What's the timeline?" "It's already in motion," Hayes said grimly. "Without Apex's leadership, the cells might go rogue, but the groundwork is there. If you don't act fast, Echelon will plunge this country into chaos." Charles stood, his jaw clenched. "Where's the command center? Where are the remaining cells?" Hayes shook his head. "I don't know. Kane compartmentalized everything. Even I didn't have full access." Charles leaned in, his voice icy. "Then what do you know, Colonel? If you want any chance at leniency, you need to start talking." Hayes hesitated again, then spoke in a low voice. "There's a failsafe. A central database that coordinates the entire network. If you find it, you can shut Echelon down." "Where is it?" Charles demanded. "Underground facility," Hayes said. "Outside Dallas. Apex disguised it as a data storage center. But it's heavily fortified. You'll need a small army to get inside." The next morning, Charles briefed his team on the mission. They would storm the facility in Dallas, seize the database, and dismantle Echelon before it could be activated. Every second counted. "This is our best shot to end this," Charles said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Apex has been one step ahead until now, but that ends today." The team moved quickly, deploying to the facility under cover of darkness. From a distance, the building appeared unremarkable, a plain, windowless structure surrounded by fencing. But Charles knew better. Beneath its surface lay the nerve center of Apex's operations. Drones circled overhead, feeding real-time images to the command center. Guards patrolled the perimeter, armed and alert. Charles and his team prepared to breach the outer defenses, their movements precise and coordinated. "On my mark," Charles said, his voice steady through the comms. 3, 2, 1. Go. The team moved in, disabling the outer cameras and silently neutralizing the guards. As they approached the entrance, they encountered the first major obstacle, a reinforced steel door with biometric locks. Rachel worked quickly, using a portable hacking device to override the system. "I'm in," she whispered. The door slid open, revealing a dimly lit corridor that descended deep into the earth. The team advanced, their weapons drawn, navigating the labyrinth of tunnels. The air grew colder, the tension thicker with every step. Finally, they reached a massive control room filled with servers, monitors, and Apex operatives scrambling to defend their stronghold. "FBI. Hands in the air." Charles shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. The operatives opened fire, and the room erupted into chaos. Charles ducked behind a console, returning fire as his team spread out to secure the room. The battle was intense, the operatives fighting with desperation, but the FBI's training and precision proved superior. As the last of the resistance was subdued, Charles and Rachel approached the central server. It was a towering structure, its screens glowing with lines of code. Rachel connected a decryption device, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "I'm in," she said. "This is it. The entire Echelon network is controlled from here." "Shut it down," Charles ordered. Rachel nodded, typing rapidly as the system's defenses fought back. Alarms blared, and the screens flashed warnings, but she didn't stop. Finally, with a triumphant keystroke, the system went dark. "Echelon is offline," Rachel said, exhaling in relief. "We've stopped it." As the team secured the facility, Charles stood in the control room, his mind racing. They had dealt a devastating blow to Apex, but the fight wasn't over. Kane's cryptic words echoed in his mind. "You're just scratching the surface." Rachel approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We did it, Charles. Silent Veil, Echelon, it's all over." Charles nodded, but his expression remained grim. "For now. But we need to stay vigilant. Apex might be down, but they're not out." As the team prepared to leave, Charles glanced back at the darkened servers. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Still, for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a glimmer of hope. Justice had prevailed, and Apex's grip on the nation had been broken. But Charles knew there were still shadows to uncover and threats to face. The fight for justice was never truly over. The Dallas raid marked a major victory for the FBI, and Charles Dawson returned to the Atlanta field office to a hero's welcome. Analysts were still combing through the data retrieved from the facility, uncovering a treasure trove of intelligence on Apex's operations. Media outlets buzzed with headlines about the takedown of a domestic terror network, but Charles wasn't celebrating yet. He knew better than to assume the battle was over. The mood in the office was one of cautious optimism. Rachel approached Charles as he sat at his desk, reviewing a report. "We've identified several Apex cells that were relying on the Echelon network," she said. "With it offline, they're in disarray. Some have gone silent, while others are trying to regroup." Charles nodded. "Good. That gives us a window to take them down." Rachel hesitated. "There's something else. Kane's been requesting to speak with you." Charles's brow furrowed. "What does he want?" "He didn't say," Rachel replied. "But knowing him, it's not a simple confession." Charles sighed, closing the report. "Let's see what he has to say." In the high-security wing of the Federal Detention Center, Dominic Kane was waiting in an interrogation room. He looked up as Charles entered, his face unreadable but his eyes sharp. "You've been busy, Kane," Charles said, taking a seat across from him. "The raid in Dallas, your network in shambles. I'd say things aren't looking good for you." Kane smirked faintly. "I see you've been enjoying the spotlight, Agent Dawson. But don't mistake a single victory for the end of the war." Charles leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You wanted to talk. So talk." Kane's smirk faded, replaced by a more serious expression. Echelon was never the endgame. It was a distraction, a test run. The real operation is already in motion. Charles's stomach tightened, but he kept his tone steady. "What operation?" Kane leaned back, his eyes gleaming with something between confidence and malice. "I've already said too much. But if you're as sharp as you think you are, you'll figure it out before it's too late." Charles didn't flinch. "Your network is gone, Kane. Your operatives are being arrested as we speak. Whatever you're planning, we'll stop it." Kane chuckled, shaking his head. "You still don't understand, do you? Apex isn't a network, it's an idea. You can arrest me, dismantle cells, shut down systems. But you can't kill an idea." Charles stood, his patience wearing thin. "We'll see about that." As he left the room, Kane called after him. "Tick-tock, Dawson. The clock's ticking." Back at the office, Charles briefed Rachel and the team on Kane's cryptic warning. "He's trying to rattle us, but we can't ignore the possibility that he's telling the truth. If there's another operation in play, we need to find it." Rachel nodded. "We'll cross-check the data from Dallas with what we've already gathered. If there's a pattern, we'll find it." For hours, the team pored over files, looking for anything that might indicate a larger plan. It was Rachel who found the first clue, a series of seemingly innocuous financial transactions flagged in the Dallas data. The funds were being funneled into shell companies linked to critical infrastructure projects in several cities. "These aren't ordinary transactions," Rachel said, showing Charles the findings. "They're setting up something big. Look at the timing and the amounts. This isn't random." Charles studied the data, his jaw tightening. These cities match the targets in Silent Vale. Apex must have a backup plan. Rachel hesitated. If Kane was telling the truth, we're running out of time. The breakthrough came late that night. One of the analysts found a coded message buried in the Dallas data, coordinates and a date. The location was a power station outside Denver, and the date was 3 days away. "This is it," Charles said, his voice grim. "Whatever they're planning, it's happening here." Rachel nodded. "We'll need every resource we've got to stop it." 3 days later, Charles and his team arrived in Denver. The power station was a sprawling facility surrounded by high fences and security cameras. It supplied energy to a significant portion of the region, making it a prime target for sabotage. FBI teams coordinated with local law enforcement, securing the perimeter while drones provided aerial surveillance. Charles led the tactical team, his focus sharp as they prepared to breach the facility. "Everyone knows the stakes," he said, addressing the team. "This isn't just about stopping Apex, it's about protecting millions of lives. Let's do this." The team moved in, breaching the outer gates and sweeping through the facility. Inside, they encountered Apex operatives planting explosives on critical infrastructure. The firefight was immediate and intense, the operatives fighting with desperation. Charles took cover behind a generator, returning fire as his team advanced. He spotted one of the operatives attempting to activate a remote detonator and quickly neutralized him with a well-placed shot. Rachel's voice crackled through the comms. "Charles, we found the main control room. They've hacked into the grid. If they succeed, they'll cause a cascading failure across multiple states." "I'm on my way," Charles replied, moving through the chaos to join her. In the control room, Rachel was working frantically to shut down the system while agents secured the area. Charles covered her, his weapon trained on the remaining operatives. "They've hardwired the explosives to the system," Rachel said. "If we can disconnect the circuits, we can stop the detonation." "Do it," Charles said, his voice firm. Rachel's fingers flew over the keyboard, bypassing layers of encryption as the seconds ticked away. Finally, she hit a key, and the system powered down. "It's done," she said, exhaling in relief. The remaining Apex operatives were subdued, their plan foiled. Charles surveyed the room, his heart pounding as the weight of the moment sank in. They had stopped the attack, but the fight against Apex was far from over. As Charles stepped outside, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. They had saved countless lives and dealt another blow to Apex. But Kane's words lingered in his mind. "You can't kill an idea." Charles knew the battle against Apex wasn't just about arrests and raids. It was about dismantling the very ideology that fueled their actions. And that fight was just beginning. The Denver raid was a success, but the weight of Kane's words stayed with Charles. Back at the Atlanta field office, the mood was subdued. Apex's operations were in disarray, but the sheer scope of their ambitions was staggering. The data retrieved from Denver revealed fragments of a larger picture, and Charles knew there was still more to uncover. Rachel entered Charles's office, holding a file. "We've decrypted more from the Dallas servers," she said, placing the file on his desk. "There's evidence that Apex was planning a third operation, a follow-up to Silent Vale and Echelon." Charles opened the file, scanning the contents. "What's the target?" Rachel hesitated. "It's not a single target. They've been working on infiltrating major financial institutions, manipulating markets, and destabilizing the economy. They call it Iron Web. If they succeed, it could trigger a global financial crisis." Charles's jaw tightened. "And Kane didn't mention this?" "No," Rachel said. "He's playing the long game, holding back information to keep us guessing. But we've identified key players tied to Iron Web, operatives embedded in financial firms, tech companies, even government agencies." Charles leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Apex wasn't just a domestic threat. They were reaching into every corner of the global infrastructure. "What's our next move?" "We've issued warrants for the identified operatives," Rachel replied. "But there's one name that stands out, Adrian Mercer. He's a financial strategist based in New York, and he's been quietly funneling money into Apex's offshore accounts." Charles nodded. "Then Mercer's our next target. We bring him in, and we cut off Apex's funding." The next morning, Charles and Rachel flew to New York to oversee the operation. Mercer's office was in a sleek high-rise in Manhattan, its glass facade reflecting the bustling city below. The FBI team prepared for a swift and surgical raid, coordinating with local authorities to minimize disruption. Charles briefed the team outside the building. Mercer is a high-value target. He's the financial backbone of Apex, and his arrest could cripple their operations. Keep it clean and efficient. Let's move. The team entered the building, swiftly securing the lobby and disabling the elevators. Charles and Rachel led the way to Mercer's office on the 38th floor, where the man was seated behind a polished desk, flanked by 2 armed guards. FBI. Charles shouted, raising his weapon. Hands in the air. The guards reacted immediately, drawing their weapons, but the FBI team was faster. The room erupted into chaos as shots rang out, glass shattering and furniture toppling. Within moments, the guards were subdued, and Mercer was pinned to the floor. You have no idea what you're doing. Mercer shouted as agents cuffed him. You're ruining everything. Tell that to the lives Apex has destroyed, Charles replied coldly. It's over, Mercer. Back at the field office, Mercer sat in an interrogation room, sweating under the harsh lights. Charles entered, accompanied by Rachel, and took a seat across from him. You've been busy, Mercer, Charles began, placing a stack of documents on the table. Funding terrorism, manipulating markets, laundering money for Apex. That's quite a resume. Mercer's hands trembled as he tried to maintain composure. You don't understand. Apex is bigger than you realize. They're not just criminals, they're visionaries. Charles's eyes narrowed. Visionaries? Apex is a terrorist organization. Mercer leaned forward, his voice desperate. They're building something new, a world where the corrupt systems collapse, and we rebuild from the ashes. Charles shook his head. And how many lives have to be destroyed for your vision? Mercer didn't answer, his gaze dropping to the table. Charles pressed on. Where is Apex's leadership hiding? Who's running Iron Web? Mercer hesitated, then sighed. You're looking for Amelia Cross. She's the real architect behind Apex's operations. Kane was just a front. Charles's pulse quickened. Where is she? I don't know, Mercer admitted. She's a ghost. But if you want to find her, you'll need to go deeper. Apex has encrypted communications buried in a server farm outside Seattle. That's where the answers are. The following day, Charles and Rachel flew to Seattle, where they prepared to raid the server farm. The facility was nondescript, hidden in an industrial park, but the FBI surveillance confirmed it was a hub for Apex's digital operations. As night fell, the FBI team moved in, disabling the facility's security and breaching the main building. Inside, rows of servers hummed with activity, their blue lights casting an eerie glow. The team worked quickly, securing the area while Rachel accessed the central server. I'm in, Rachel said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. This is it. Apex's encrypted communications, financial records, and operational plans. Download everything, Charles ordered, keeping watch as Rachel worked. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a voice crackled over the intercom. Agent Dawson. You've been persistent, I'll give you that. Charles's blood ran cold. It was Amelia Cross. I've been watching you, the voice continued, calm and measured. You've been dismantling Apex piece by piece. Impressive, but ultimately futile. Charles scanned the room, his weapon drawn. Your time is up, Cross. We're shutting you down. Cross chuckled softly. You're shutting down a facility, nothing more. Apex is an idea, and ideas are immortal. As her voice faded, an alarm blared, and the servers began to overload. Rachel's eyes widened. She's triggering a data wipe. We're going to lose everything. Can you stop it? Charles asked. I'll try, Rachel said, her hands moving frantically over the keyboard. But I need time. Charles rallied the team to defend the facility as Apex operatives stormed the building, determined to destroy the evidence. The firefight was intense, but the FBI held their ground, giving Rachel the time she needed. Finally, Rachel hit a key, and the alarms silenced. I've got it, she shouted. The data's secure. As the last Apex operative was subdued, Charles stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving. They had struck another blow against Apex, but Amelia Cross had escaped. For now. Back at the field office, the data from Seattle revealed Apex's deepest secrets, names, locations, and the full extent of their operations. It was a treasure trove of intelligence, but Charles knew the fight wasn't over. Amelia Cross was still out there, and as long as she remained free, Apex would continue to rise from the shadows. "This isn't the end," Rachel said, handing Charles a coffee as they pored over the data. "But it's a hell of a start." Charles nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We'll find her. And when we do, this ends for good." The intelligence recovered from the Seattle server farm was the breakthrough Charles Dawson and his team needed. For weeks, they worked tirelessly, dismantling the remnants of Apex's network city by city. High-profile arrests were made, bank accounts frozen, and safe houses raided. The pieces of Apex's empire were crumbling, but Amelia Cross, the elusive mastermind, remained a step ahead. The turning point came when Rachel uncovered a lead hidden deep within the Seattle data. A secure communication between Cross and an unknown operative revealed plans for a final Apex stronghold, a hidden compound deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The location was encrypted with layers of security, but the coordinates were clear. "This is it," Charles said, standing in the war room with his team. A large map of the Appalachian region was displayed on the wall, with the compound marked. "Amelia Cross is there, and this is our chance to end this once and for all." The Appalachian compound was a fortress. Tucked into the dense forest, it was surrounded by high walls, motion sensors, and armed guards. The FBI assembled a task force for the operation, combining agents, tactical units, and aerial surveillance to ensure no one escaped. Charles led the mission, his focus sharper than ever. As the team approached the compound under the cover of darkness, the tension was palpable. The stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just a raid. This was the culmination of months of relentless pursuit. "Move in," Charles commanded through the comms. The operation was swift and surgical. The perimeter guards were neutralized, and the team breached the compound's gates. Inside, Apex operatives mounted a fierce defense, but they were outmatched by the FBI's precision and firepower. Charles moved through the chaos, his weapon drawn, searching for Amelia Cross. He reached the central building and found her in a high-tech control room, surrounded by monitors displaying live feeds of the battle outside. "Amelia Cross," Charles said, his voice steady as he leveled his weapon. "It's over." Cross turned slowly, her expression calm despite the situation. She was a tall woman with sharp features and piercing eyes, exuding an air of cold authority. "Agent Dawson," she said, her tone almost amused. "You've been quite the thorn in my side." "Hands where I can see them," Charles ordered. Cross raised her hands, but her smirk remained. "You've won the battle, Agent Dawson, but the war? That's far from over. Apex isn't just me, it's everyone who believes the system is broken." Charles didn't lower his weapon. "Your empire is falling apart. Your operatives are in custody, your plans exposed. It ends here." Cross's smirk faltered, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. "Perhaps. But you can't fix what's already broken." Charles stepped closer, his voice cold. "We'll see about that." He cuffed her and led her out of the control room, past the remnants of her operation. Outside, the compound was secured, the remaining Apex operatives detained. As dawn broke over the mountains, the long fight against Apex finally felt like it had reached its conclusion. Back at the Atlanta field office, the atmosphere was one of triumph. Amelia Cross's arrest was a major victory, and the data retrieved from her compound revealed the final pieces of Apex's operations. The arrests that followed dismantled the organization completely. Charles stood in the observation room, watching Cross as she sat in an interrogation room. Her composure was unbroken, but Charles knew her influence was gone. Apex was finished. Rachel joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "She's still claiming Apex will rise again," she said. "But with the evidence we have, she won't see the outside of a prison cell for the rest of her life." Charles nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Apex may be done, but the ideology behind it isn't. There will always be those who want to tear the system down." Rachel smiled faintly. "And there will always be people like you to stop them." Charles allowed himself a small smile. For the first time in months, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. The fight against Apex had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but justice had prevailed. Months later, Charles stood on the steps of the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., addressing a crowd of reporters. The operation against Apex had been one of the largest in the agency's history, and the public demanded answers. "Apex sought to undermine our institutions, destabilize our economy, and sow chaos," Charles said, his voice steady. But through the dedication and bravery of countless agents and officers, we dismantled their network and brought those responsible to justice. Let this serve as a message to anyone who seeks to harm our nation. We will not falter, and we will not fail. The crowd erupted into applause, but Charles's thoughts were elsewhere. He thought of Tyrell, the young boy who had been the catalyst for everything. The memory of that moment on the street reminded him why he fought so hard, for justice, for fairness, and for the countless lives impacted by people like Kane and Cross. As the crowd dispersed, Charles stepped away from the podium, feeling a sense of closure. The battle against Apex was over, but his work wasn't done. The pursuit of justice never ended, and Charles Dawson was ready for whatever came next. For now, though, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The sun was shining, and for the first time in a long time, the world felt just a little brighter.